What's up, guys? Mr. Dancer. Today's Wild Eye film is a 2007 documentary called The Search for Weng. The bizarre history of Filipino B films as told through filmmaker Andrew Leavold's personal quest to find the truth behind its midget James Bond superstar, Weng. This is a really solid documentary, and it was actually pretty fascinating. And it basically tells the story of this filmmaker and collector of strange films from Australia who became fascinated with Filipino B films from the 70s and 80s, some of which at least, starred this diminutive little star named Weng. Most significantly was a James Bond spoof called For Your Height Only, and there were some sequels. There were also some cowboy type spoofs and some crazy ninja movies that he would appear in, but he would typically be the hero. And again, this is in the early 2000s. Clips of him started to show up on the internet. Somebody actually wrote a song about him internationally that kind of achieved some early internet buzz. And there were a lot of rumors about who he was and what had happened to him. And the filmmaker eventually just went to the Philippines to find out. And it's really the story of trying to answer as many questions as possible about Weng. Who was he for real? What was his real name? Leavold didn't even know if he was alive at the time or not. What had happened to him, and what is sort of the significance of these crazy types of films in film history. And it's also an interesting snapshot into the Philippines. At that time, in the late 70s and 80s, they were mimicking a lot of the action films from the West and mixed with the martial arts films from the East, and they were actually the second largest producers of film in the world. So interestingly enough, the filmmaker goes to the Philippines. He goes to like a film museum, and he gets pretty much nowhere. In the parking lot, he meets a guy who was the editor on all the Weng films, and he flips out. He's like, "Oh my goodness!" So one thing leads to another, and he ends up meeting all these old school guys who worked as stuntmen and actors in all these films, and he just keeps meeting different people, and they all start telling Weng stories. And after a while, the story pretty much emerges that it was two producers, a married couple named Peter and Cora Caballas, who kind of took him in and adopted him and had him star in their films. So then a few questions emerge. Was it an actual adoption? How well did they treat him? And was he compensated fairly for his roles? And then what happened? Eventually the couple split up, just to not to give a huge spoiler, and that was sort of coinciding with the downside of some of these crazy films, I think. And it really is an interesting snapshot into the Philippines, because Weng came from a very poor little town, and they do finally catch up with some family members of his, and this film, in case you haven't guessed, it goes in some pretty sad places. It is not the most tragic story you've ever heard, but it's not the happiest either. Apparently Weng was, they would ask people what he was like, and they would say he had a kind of a sadness about him. He would joke around, but there was a kind of sadness there, and it's pretty sad. There's some pretty sad parts. Now, the film also goes in some pretty unexpected places. One of the people that they interview, believe it or not, was Imelda Marcos, who was the former First Lady. Like when I was in high school, her and her husband ruled the Philippines with an iron fist, like through martial law. Very controversial. Her son is just about to become president right now, amazingly. But she was a big patron of the arts, and she had sponsored a film festival. And just to show you how popular Weng was, she had all these foreign film stars and companies come to the Philippines, and the film that was marketed internationally the most was the Weng movie. okay? And he was kind of like the star of the festival with like foreign stars, you know, kissing him and things like that. And there was a lot of articles written about him. And overall, I found it fascinating. It was a very engaging documentary, very well done. I loved when all these old Filipino actors got together. I mean, I just love to hear these guys talk and tell stories about like the glory days. It was a lot of fun. And it really is kind of interesting. It's an interesting film. I highly recommend it. It's on Tubi, available on Tubi. And the director has also, I believe, come out with a book too, if you're interested. As a matter of fact, I think this might be the cover here. So today has been the documentary entry for Wild Eye Week. Come back tomorrow and see what I have. All right, thanks a lot, guys.